The wind in Harbin doesn't just carry snow. It carries secrets that were meant to stay frozen forever. Imagine a place so hidden, so terrifying, that even the maps refuse to acknowledge its existence. You are looking at the edge of Pingfan, a landscape of pale ice, rising smoke, and silent fences. But behind these brick walls, the laws of humanity have already been erased. Welcome to the darkest shadow of World War II. Welcome to Unit 731. If you are listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps in the quiet of the night, or amidst the rush of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we step further into the shadows of this enigma, if you are a soul drawn to the whispers of the past and the mysteries the world forgot, you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us journey into the depths of history where the truth remains hidden and every story carries a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories, and today we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. Winter settled over the outer edges of Harbin with a weight that seemed older than the railway itself. Snow gathered along the narrow roads leading toward the southern districts where military trucks sometimes disappeared behind guarded fences. The Songhua River carried broad sheets of dull ice beneath the pale morning sky, while thin smoke drifted upward from factory chimneys beyond the rail yard. Wooden houses stood close together against the cold wind arriving from the northern plains of Manchuria. Telegraph poles leaned slightly beneath layers of frost, and frozen tracks stretched into the distance beside empty warehouses painted in fading black characters from another decade. The air surrounding the settlement carried many small sounds that blended quietly beneath the winter weather. Coal burned inside iron stoves through the long evenings, filling narrow streets with a bitter scent that clung to heavy coats and wool scarves. Steam escaped from train engines with deep sighing noises that rolled slowly across the frozen ground before fading into the dark. Men waiting beside freight platforms rubbed their hands together while snowflakes settled across their hats and shoulders. Somewhere behind the station walls a metal door slammed shut, followed by the faint barking of dogs hidden within the drifting white haze near the outer compounds. As the weeks passed deeper into the season, movement around the settlement became harder to notice beneath the thick weather. Horse carts arrived carrying timber and barrels covered with frozen canvas, leaving curved tracks through the packed snow before vanishing toward guarded roads near Pingfan. Railway workers cleared ice from switches with heavy tools while soldiers crossed the platforms in dark uniforms dusted with pale frost. At sunrise, smoke from distant industrial buildings widened into gray clouds that drifted slowly over the countryside. The settlement itself appeared to grow outward during those months, with new fences, storage buildings, and utility poles emerging quietly against the frozen horizon. For many people living near Harbin during those years, the landscape carried an uneasy feeling that stayed difficult to explain directly. The winter scenery looked calm from a distance, yet the guarded roads and unfamiliar construction projects introduced quiet tension into ordinary routines. Farmers traveling through nearby villages sometimes lowered their voices when military vehicles passed across the icy roads toward restricted areas outside the city. Even the railway stations seemed touched by a strange emotional distance, as though travelers understood that certain destinations should not be discussed openly. Beneath the drifting snow and endless northern wind, the region slowly absorbed the presence of something hidden from public sight. Beyond the crowded center of Harbin, the countryside opened into long fields buried beneath layers of winter snow that reached almost to the fences surrounding isolated farmhouses. During the early mornings, Pale sunlight moved carefully across the frozen plains, touching abandoned wagons, collapsed wooden sheds, and narrow irrigation ditches hidden beneath hard ice. Small villages appeared scattered across the landscape like dark marks against endless white ground. Smoke drifted from low chimneys beside frozen wells where buckets remained overturned until afternoon. Along distant roads, military trucks sometimes traveled in pairs through the countryside, their engines echoing faintly across the cold open land before disappearing behind rows of leafless trees. The northern wind carried textures that people living there learned to recognize without looking directly toward the horizon. Loose snow swept across open fields with a dry whispering sound that resembled sand moving across stone. Boots pressed into the frozen earth produced short cracking noises that disappeared quickly beneath the heavy air. Inside roadside stations, damp gloves hung near stoves while travelers warmed bowls of thin soup between stiff hands reddened by cold weather. Train whistles arrived from far away during the evenings, stretching across the dark countryside in long, lonely tones. Sometimes the smell of burning coal mixed with the sharper scent of frozen metal drifting from rail depots outside the city. During the late 1930s, the outer districts near Pingfan changed gradually beneath increasing military activity connected to the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Construction crews appeared beside remote roads where little traffic had existed only months earlier. New rail lines extended toward guarded compounds hidden beyond wide snow-covered fields, while workers unloaded timber, steel pipes, and heavy machinery from freight cars arriving before dawn. Civilian laborers moved carefully under military supervision, often speaking quietly while carrying supplies across frozen ground hardened like stone. At night, lanterns glowed behind temporary structures built near the expanding facilities, creating scattered points of yellow light beneath the vast darkness surrounding the settlement. Many residents nearby could sense that the region was becoming divided into separate worlds that rarely touched openly. Markets continued operating in the city streets. Children still crossed snowy alleys carrying bundles of firewood, and old men gathered inside tea houses to escape the cold afternoons. Yet beyond those familiar routines stood another environment shaped by secrecy and distance. Travelers occasionally noticed barriers appearing along certain roads, guarded checkpoints near railway crossings, or warning signs placed beside fenced property outside Pingfan. Conversations often paused when unfamiliar officials entered public spaces, in quiet ways that remained difficult to measure directly. Daily life around Harbin began adjusting itself around invisible boundaries that few people fully understood. The railway lines running south of Harbin formed long dark paths across the frozen countryside, cutting through empty plains and industrial districts with quiet precision. Iron tracks disappeared beneath layers of packed snow before reappearing again near switching stations surrounded by signal towers and storage depots. Freight trains moved slowly through the winter landscape carrying coal, machinery, lumber, and sealed cargo containers marked with military symbols. Frost gathered heavily along the steel rails during the night, leaving pale white edges that reflected weak morning light beneath cloudy skies. Near Pingfan, the rail network expanded outward toward newly constructed sidings where guards occasionally stood watching the arriving cars from narrow elevated platforms. Inside the station areas, warmth and cold existed side by side in uncomfortable contrast. Passengers entering waiting rooms carried sharp gusts of icy wind through heavy wooden doors before gathering near cast iron heaters glowing faintly beside the walls. Wet wool coats released the smell of melting snow into crowded rooms where railway clerks stamped papers beneath dim electric lamps. Outside, the air tasted dry and metallic around the locomotives preparing for departure. Steam drifted upward from engine valves with soft hissing sounds that blended with distant hammering from repair sheds nearby. During evening hours, the vibration of moving trains could sometimes be felt through the station floors before the engines themselves became visible through the darkness. As military influence strengthened across occupied Manchuria, the rhythm of transportation around Harbin slowly shifted towards stricter organization and greater control. Freight schedules became more guarded, and sections of railway activity near Pingfan drew increasing attention from military police stationed along the lines. Workers loading supplies often noticed unfamiliar shipments arriving inside locked containers escorted directly toward restricted compounds beyond the rail yards. Additional communication poles appeared beside the tracks, carrying wires that stretched across the winter plains toward isolated facilities hidden from civilian access. During snowstorms, crews continued clearing the rail switches through the night, so transport routes remained active despite the harsh weather pressing heavily across the region. For those living near the railway districts, the trains became connected with feelings that extended beyond ordinary travel or commerce. Their arrival during late hours carried an uneasy emotional weight shaped by secrecy, silence, and incomplete understanding. Families living near the tracks sometimes woke to the sound of engines passing slowly through the darkness long after midnight, followed by unusual activity near guarded sidings outside the city. Even people who never approached the restricted compounds sensed that certain movements along the railway belonged to hidden purposes. The endless sound of steel wheels crossing frozen ground became part of the psychological atmosphere surrounding Harbin during those long, occupied winters. Far beyond the busiest streets of Harbin, the winter sky often appeared larger than the land beneath it. Flat stretches of frozen countryside extended toward distant tree lines where thin forests stood dark against the pale horizon. During daylight hours, weak sunlight moved slowly through layers of gray cloud, casting faint reflections across icy fields and frozen irrigation canals. Telegraph wires crossed above the roads in long, uneven lines that trembled slightly during strong northern winds. Near isolated military areas outside Pingfan, watchtowers rose above the snow-covered terrain beside fences buried almost halfway beneath drifting ice. From a distance, the structures looked less like buildings and more like rigid shapes pressed quietly into the frozen earth. The weather carried a physical heaviness that settled into ordinary life during the longest months of the season. Breath froze quickly against scarves and collars while exposed skin tightened painfully beneath the wind moving across the plains. Snowflakes collected inside eyelashes and along the edges of hats before melting near heated rooms filled with the scent of damp wool and coal smoke. In the evenings, windows rattled softly when gusts swept across the settlement from the open countryside. The distant hum of industrial generators mixed with the sharper sound of wind pushing through narrow alleyways between wooden buildings. Even silence seemed textured there, shaped by cold air and the constant pressure of winter weather. Gradually, signs of expansion continued appearing around the military districts connected to Unit 731. Construction materials arrived steadily despite the severe climate, and workers spent long hours reinforcing roads hardened by frost. Utility poles multiplied beside remote pathways where almost no civilian traffic passed anymore. New pipes disappeared beneath the ground, while warehouses rose near rail connections hidden from the central districts of Harbin. At certain hours, columns of smoke climbed from chimneys within the restricted compounds, spreading slowly into the pale afternoon sky before dissolving above the plains. During nighttime snowfalls, Lights from guarded buildings glowed faintly through the weather, creating blurred patches of color against the surrounding darkness. People living near these outer areas developed quiet habits, shaped by caution and observation. Shopkeepers along nearby roads learned which convoys passed regularly and which arrivals brought unfamiliar tension into the settlement. Farmers traveling between villages sometimes altered their routes to avoid military checkpoints established along frozen intersections outside Pingfan. Conversations inside crowded tea houses occasionally drifted toward rumors about hidden facilities beyond the rail lines, though voices often softened before details became too direct. Many residents understood only fragments of what existed there. Yet the atmosphere surrounding those compounds slowly entered public awareness through feeling rather than explanation. Winter itself seemed to carry those suspicions outward across the snow-covered countryside surrounding Harbin. The evenings around Harbin arrived early during the deepest part of winter, when darkness settled across the countryside before most workers had returned home from the rail yards and industrial districts. Lamps began glowing behind frosted windows while narrow streets, filled with long blue shadows cast by utility poles and telephone wires. Along the outer roads leading toward Pingfan, snow reflected faint traces of moonlight across empty stretches of frozen ground. Chimneys released slow streams of smoke that drifted sideways beneath the heavy sky before disappearing into the night air. In distant areas beyond the civilian neighborhoods, guarded compounds remained visible only through scattered lights shining dimly behind fences buried under layers of snow. Night introduced a different collection of sounds that traveled farther through the frozen atmosphere than they did during daylight hours. The creaking of wagon wheels carried across icy roads with unusual clarity, followed sometimes by the dull rhythm of horses moving carefully through packed snow. Train engines produced deep metallic groans while slowing near switching stations outside the city. Somewhere beyond the rail lines, factory whistles occasionally echoed through the darkness before fading into the open countryside. Inside small wooden homes, people listened quietly beside coal stoves while kettles trembled softly over heat. The cold outside pressed against windows and doors with a force that could almost be felt inside the rooms themselves. As months passed, the guarded districts beyond Harbin developed an increasingly separate rhythm from the ordinary life surrounding them. Military schedules continued regardless of weather conditions, and activity around the restricted compounds often increased during the late evening hours. Trucks moved along isolated roads after sunset, carrying covered supplies toward areas closed to civilians. Additional guard posts appeared near rail crossings and storage depots connected to the expanding facilities. Workers assigned to nearby construction projects sometimes noticed lights remaining active throughout the night inside laboratory buildings hidden behind fences. Even during heavy snowfall, movement continued steadily through those controlled spaces, suggesting operations that followed priorities disconnected from the natural rhythm of the surrounding countryside. For local residents, nighttime gradually became associated with uncertainty as much as with rest. Families learned to recognize unfamiliar engine sounds arriving after midnight or the appearance of armed patrols moving along roads that once remained quiet after dark. Some travelers avoided isolated routes near the compounds entirely during winter evenings, preferring longer paths through crowded districts where ordinary life still felt visible and understandable. Yet no clear explanation fully settled over the region. Instead, suspicion existed like the northern wind itself, moving invisibly through conversations, gestures, and half-finished thoughts. Beneath the frozen skies of occupied Manchuria, many people sensed that hidden events were unfolding nearby, though few could describe their full shape aloud. By the end of each long winter, the landscape surrounding Harbin carried visible marks left behind by months of cold weather and military expansion. Snow near the rail yards turned dark beneath layers of cold dust, and ash drifting from locomotives that moved constantly through the occupied region. Roads leading toward Pingfan hardened into uneven tracks of ice where heavy vehicles had passed repeatedly across the frozen ground. Wooden fences leaned beneath the pressure of accumulated snow while abandoned crates and broken barrels remained half buried near storage depots outside the city. Across the distant plains, smokestacks continued releasing gray columns into the pale sky, leaving the horizon covered in a faint industrial haze that lingered above the settlement. The approach of spring did not arrive suddenly in northern Manchuria. Instead, small physical changes emerged slowly through sound, texture, and temperature. Thin drops of water began falling from roof edges during warmer afternoons, tapping softly against frozen earth beneath crowded alleyways. Ice along the railway tracks loosened unevenly, producing sharp cracking noises as trains rolled southward toward the military districts. Damp soil appeared beside roadways where snowbanks had started collapsing inward under weak sunlight. The smell of coal smoke mixed now with wet wood, muddy ground, and thawing water carried through drainage channels near the outer villages. Even the wind felt different during those weeks, carrying less sharpness than it had during the center of winter. Yet beneath those seasonal changes, the hidden structure of the region remained firmly in place. The guarded compounds near Pingfan continued operating behind their fences while construction crews repaired roads damaged by months of severe weather. Freight deliveries arrived steadily through the railway network connecting Harbin to the wider territory controlled by the Japanese occupation. Military patrols maintained their routines across checkpoints established during previous winters, and civilian workers continued moving between industrial facilities under strict supervision. As snow slowly disappeared from the countryside, more of the expanding infrastructure became visible across the open plains. Pipes, utility lines, storage buildings, and rail connections stretched outward in organized patterns that revealed the growing scale of the hidden complex. For those who lived through those years near Harbin, memory often became attached less to individual events and more to the atmosphere surrounding the region itself. The endless winters, the guarded roads, the late-night trains, and the distant smoke drifting above frozen fields settled deeply into personal recollection long after specific details faded. Many residents carried an awareness that something deeply troubling existed beyond the visible surface of ordinary life, though fear and uncertainty often prevented direct discussion. The cold environment seemed to absorb those emotions into the landscape. Long after darkness covered the rail yards each evening, the frozen edge of Harbin continued holding its quiet secrets beneath the northern sky. But as the snow deepened, so did the shadows. What was being built in the dead of night wasn't just a military outpost. It was a factory of a different kind, a place where the architecture itself was designed to swallow the truth. The compound near Pingfan spread across the frozen land like a carefully measured wound hidden behind military fences. Rows of brick buildings stood beside wide internal roads packed hard by vehicle traffic and bitter weather. Tall chimneys rose above the rooftops, releasing steady streams of smoke that drifted across the pale morning sky. Too organized, too purposeful to belong to any ordinary facility. Water towers overlooked the grounds from elevated steel frames. Guard posts marked every entrance between sections. Some structures appeared plain and administrative from the outside. Others carried thick walls, reinforced doors, and windows positioned unusually high above the ground. as though whatever happened inside was never meant to be witnessed. Beneath the snow-covered courtyards, underground tunnels quietly connected separate parts of the compound in darkness. Inside the outer gates, the environment carried a mixture of industrial sounds and enclosed pressure that settled over anyone moving through the facility. Boots echoed sharply across concrete corridors where electric lamps hummed faintly against white-painted walls. Steam pipes rattled inside utility rooms warmed by coal-fired boilers hidden below the main buildings. The smell of disinfectant blended with smoke drifting inward whenever heavy doors opened toward the courtyards outside. Metal carts rolled through connecting hallways with low grinding noises that faded behind locked entrances. During windy evenings, air moved across the compound carrying soot, chemical odors, and the distant barking of dogs somewhere beyond the fenced perimeter, sounds that, taken together, produced a feeling impossible to fully identify and equally impossible to dismiss. As the complex expanded through the late 1930s, new sections appeared around the original buildings in carefully organized stages. Additional fences divided the grounds into smaller controlled zones where movement became more restricted over time. Narrow rail tracks extended into storage areas hidden behind warehouses near the rear sections. Electric cables and water pipes spread beneath the frozen ground toward fresh construction sites, marked by scaffolding and temporary sheds. Gradually, the facility developed the appearance of a self-contained settlement, designed not for ordinary civilian life, but for continuous controlled activity hidden behind guarded boundaries that grew tighter with each passing season. For people who later described the compound, the strongest impression often came not from visible destruction, but from its unsettling sense of order. Every road, wall, tunnel, and courtyard appeared placed according to strict purpose, creating an atmosphere where even empty spaces felt intentional. Visitors entering the grounds sometimes noticed how quickly the outside world disappeared behind the gates and fences. The layout encouraged silence, separation, and controlled movement between different sections of the facility. Beneath the cold industrial surfaces of brick and steel, the compound carried a psychological weight shaped entirely by secrecy, communicating authority quietly, through distance, repetition, and the careful organization of space itself. Near the center of the compound, the largest buildings stood in long rectangular rows separated by internal roads wide enough for trucks to pass at all hours. Their brick walls carried dark stains left by years of smoke rising from nearby boiler houses. Narrow windows reflected pale daylight without revealing much of the rooms behind them. Between the structures, fenced courtyards opened into carefully measured spaces containing storage sheds, loading ramps, and utility stations connected by overhead wires crossing silently above the grounds. Walking through those interior sections brought an awareness of changing textures and temperatures. Heated corridors creating brief pockets of warmth before metal doors opened again toward freezing courtyards swept by northern winds. Somewhere inside the connected buildings, machinery produced low mechanical vibrations that could be felt through the floors more easily than heard directly. Over time, the internal organization of the compound grew increasingly layered as additional structures filled the open land between the original buildings. Guard stations multiplied near entrances leading into restricted sections where access required written authorization and military approval. Construction rarely seemed fully finished there. Even during winter months, workers continued repairing walls, expanding storage rooms, and reinforcing foundations against the shifting frozen ground, as though the compound were a living thing, quietly growing, quietly breathing, quietly consuming everything around it. For many who later studied the facility, Its design created unease precisely because it resembled an ordinary industrial district while concealing activities far removed from ordinary industry. The buildings appeared practical and organized, almost administrative in their careful arrangement. Yet that same efficiency carried a deep discomfort. Every corridor and enclosed courtyard designed to separate people from one another, to reduce visibility, to encourage controlled movement through gates and checkpoints and divided passageways. Inside such an environment, the human presence felt secondary to the system surrounding it. The compound expressed power quietly, through structure and planning, shaping behavior through walls, locked doors, and invisible boundaries woven into the physical design of the place itself. Beneath several sections of the compound, underground passageways extended quietly below the surface like hidden arteries connecting the major buildings. Concrete tunnels ran beneath courtyards and administrative blocks, protected from the severe winters that buried Pingfan in deep snow for months at a time. Some corridors were narrow and lined with exposed pipes carrying steam and water through the underground network. Others opened into wider service areas containing storage chambers, utility controls, and reinforced doors fitted with heavy steel handles. Ventilation shafts rose toward the surface at measured intervals, allowing thin streams of warm air to escape into the frozen courtyards above. From outside, only small metal grates hinted at the structures concealed beneath the compound. Small, easily overlooked, easily ignored. The underground spaces carried their own distinct atmosphere, entirely separated from the weather and open air beyond the walls. Footsteps echoed softly through enclosed concrete corridors where electric bulbs cast pale yellow light across damp surfaces. Warm metal, wet stone, machine oil, and chemical residue blended together inside the tunnels, creating an enclosed industrial scent that lingered in the still air. Somewhere deeper within the system, distant machinery produced steady vibrations that traveled faintly through the walls and floors, a presence rather than a sound, felt in the chest before it registered in the ears. As the facility expanded, these hidden routes became increasingly important to the internal operation of the compound. Workers used the tunnels to move equipment and supplies between separate laboratory sections during harsh winter storms. Additional service corridors were excavated beneath newer buildings, allowing guarded movement through areas hidden entirely from outside observation. Over time, the underground system developed into a second layer of the compound itself, mirroring the controlled structure visible above the surface while remaining almost entirely concealed from ordinary view. For those who later learned about the tunnels, they represented more than practical engineering. They reflected the broader mentality shaping the entire compound: hidden movement, restricted access, and deliberate separation from public visibility built directly into the architecture of the place. The laboratory buildings occupied some of the most heavily secured sections inside the compound, arranged behind secondary fences and guarded entrances that separated them from the outer administrative areas. Their exterior walls appeared severe and functional, built from dark brick reinforced with concrete foundations. Tall chimneys stood nearby beside utility structures supplying heat and power through underground systems. Some laboratory wings contained rows of narrow windows placed high above eye level, limiting any clear view inside from the courtyards outside. Loading platforms and service doors faced inward toward restricted roads where covered vehicles arrived quietly during early morning hours beneath the drifting winter sky. Inside those buildings, the environment felt colder in an emotional sense than in temperature alone. Long tiled corridors reflected electric light with a pale brightness that revealed every movement across polished floors. Glass containers lined metal shelves inside storage rooms carrying the sharp scent of chemicals and disinfectants. Water pipes hissed softly behind the walls. Somewhere nearby, unseen equipment clicked steadily beneath the distant hum of electrical generators operating continuously throughout the compound. Metal trays, instruments, and rolling carts produced brief echoes whenever they touched concrete surfaces, sudden sounds that faded quickly into the enclosed stillness of the laboratories, as though the rooms themselves were absorbing everything that happened inside them. As research operations increased, additional laboratory sections were attached to the existing buildings through enclosed hallways and service passages. New security checkpoints emerged inside the buildings themselves, dividing corridors into separate controlled areas where only authorized personnel could continue beyond locked doors monitored by guards. For many observers studying the compound years later, the laboratories revealed how architecture could quietly shape moral distance within institutional systems. The buildings looked clinical and rational, designed according to scientific efficiency. Yet that same careful order contributed to a deeper discomfort, transforming whatever occurred inside into something hidden behind procedures, walls, and administrative separation. Brick, steel, glass, and concrete became more than construction materials. Together, they formed an atmosphere where secrecy and authority settled deeply into the physical design of everyday space. The courtyards created open spaces between the larger buildings where daily movement unfolded beneath the exposed northern sky. Snow collected unevenly across these open areas during winter storms, gathering deeply beside fences and utility sheds where the wind pushed it into hardened drifts. Moving through those outdoor sections brought constant awareness of exposure to weather and surveillance simultaneously. The cold air struck faces and hands sharply after leaving heated interiors. Smoke from nearby chimneys drifted low across the open spaces, mixing with the smell of coal ash, machine oil, and damp concrete. Conversations outside often remained short, shaped partly by the cold and partly by the atmosphere surrounding the restricted compound itself. As the facility grew larger, even those empty spaces between structures became carefully managed parts of the larger system, designed to regulate visibility, movement, and access across the entire grounds. At the outer edges of the compound, the perimeter fences stretched across the frozen landscape in long measured lines that separated the facility from the surrounding countryside. Layers of barbed wire ran between heavy wooden posts reinforced with concrete foundations buried beneath the ground. Watchtowers overlooked the boundary at regular intervals. Large entrance gates controlled the main access points where military vehicles entered beneath armed supervision. During winter evenings, searchlights swept slowly across the snow-covered perimeter, casting pale, moving beams over frozen earth and drifting ice. Beyond those guarded borders, the wider plains of Manchuria extended outward beneath the cold northern sky, ordinary, open, and entirely unaware of what lay hidden behind the wire. The atmosphere near the perimeter carried a different kind of tension from the enclosed spaces deeper inside the facility. Wind moved more freely there, rattling loose wire against the fences and pushing snow through gaps beneath the gates. Guards standing watch inside elevated towers heard the distant sounds of trains crossing nearby rail lines during the late hours of the night. Sometimes dogs barked somewhere along the outer patrol routes, their voices carrying far across the open ground before silence reclaimed the darkness. Footsteps sounded isolated near the perimeter, swallowed quickly by the wide empty space surrounding the compound, as though the land itself were cooperating in the concealment. As years passed, The security systems protecting the facility became more extensive and organized. Communication wires linked watchtowers directly to guard stations positioned near the central entrances. Storage bunkers and checkpoint shelters were reinforced against winter conditions so surveillance could continue continuously through severe storms. Even the landscape outside the fences gradually changed under military control. Nearby roads became more restricted, civilian movement faced increasing scrutiny, and open land surrounding the compound transformed into a carefully monitored buffer zone separating the hidden facility from ordinary public life. For people who later studied the physical design of Unit 731, the perimeter represented more than protection from intrusion. The fences and watchtowers symbolized the deliberate separation between two realities existing beside one another in occupied Manchuria. Outside the barriers, villages, rail stations, markets, and ordinary winter routines continued beneath the same northern sky. Inside the guarded compound, another world operated according to secrecy, hierarchy, and concealed purpose. The architecture of the perimeter turned distance itself into a form of control, shaping what could be seen, what could be known, and what could never be approached. Across the frozen fields near Harbin, the walls of the compound quietly divided public life from hidden history. And hidden within those walls, within those tunnels, those corridors, those locked and windowless rooms, something was happening that the world was never supposed to learn about. The walls were up, the fences were guarded. But a facility of this scale needs more than just bricks and mortar. It needs a heartbeat. A cold, bureaucratic rhythm that keeps the nightmare running like clockwork. Let's look inside the daily life of those who pulled the levers. Before sunrise reached the compound at Pingfan, lights already glowed behind the frosted windows of the administrative and laboratory buildings. Guards crossed the courtyards in heavy winter coats while thin smoke climbed from boiler houses warming the facility against the Manchurian cold. Trucks waited near loading areas with engines idling softly beside piles of snow darkened by coal ash. Inside barracks and staff quarters, uniforms hung drying near heaters beside polished boots arranged carefully beneath wooden beds. Clerks prepared stacks of documents on narrow desks lined with ink bottles, rubber stamps, and military schedules. Across the compound, the layout of roads, gates, and buildings guided the beginning of another carefully ordered day, indistinguishable on the surface from any other military installation in occupied Manchuria. Morning inside the facility unfolded through small repeated sounds and familiar physical habits that shaped the atmosphere more than any spoken command. Metal cups touched against dining tables, while cooks poured rice porridge into steaming bowls. Wet gloves warmed beside radiators, releasing the scent of damp wool into narrow changing rooms where staff buttoned uniforms beneath pale electric lights. Somewhere along the corridors, telephones rang briefly before disappearing beneath the low murmur of conversation and moving footsteps. Outside, guards inhaled sharp cold air during shift changes while snow crunched beneath boots crossing the frozen courtyards toward the main entrances. Everything looked routine. Everything looked ordinary. That, perhaps, was the most disturbing thing of all. As the day progressed, different groups inside the compound moved according to tightly arranged schedules that connected ordinary duties to the larger operations surrounding them. Drivers transported supplies between storage depots and laboratory wings. Office workers carried folders through administrative corridors marked by military notices and inspection charts. Doctors attended meetings in heated rooms where paperwork covered long tables beneath hanging lamps. Guards rotated positions at checkpoints according to precise timetables recorded carefully by supervising officers. In kitchens and maintenance areas, workers cleaned equipment, repaired damaged tools, and prepared supplies for the following day. Through repetition and organization, the routines of the compound gradually shaped themselves into a complete internal system, one that ran smoothly, efficiently, and without visible conscience. For many people working inside Unit 731, routine may have softened awareness of the larger reality surrounding their daily responsibilities. Repeated schedules, familiar tasks, and structured procedures created a sense of ordinary working life within the guarded environment. Meals arrived at expected hours. Reports required signatures. Uniforms needed cleaning. Vehicles demanded maintenance regardless of what occurred elsewhere behind locked doors. The rhythm of administration and labor encouraged attention toward immediate responsibilities rather than broader moral reflection. Inside systems built upon hierarchy and repetition, ordinary habits sometimes carried frightening consequences. In Pingfan, bureaucratic order quietly surrounded one of the darkest operations of the 20th century, and that order made it possible. During the early morning hours, clerks inside the administrative offices began their work before much of the compound became fully active. Long wooden desks stood beneath hanging lamps where stacks of papers waited beside ink pads, ledgers, and military forms stamped with official markings. Filing cabinets lined the walls beside narrow, frost-coated windows. Officers moved through these rooms carrying folders tied carefully with string while typists recorded schedules and transport records on mechanical machines, producing sharp metallic clicks across the quiet offices. Near the entrances, wall calendars and duty rosters displayed the structure of each day in careful detail. Even the smallest office reflected the larger discipline shaping every corner of the compound. Nothing left to chance, nothing left unexplained, nothing left unrecorded. The administrative buildings carried a distinct atmosphere compared to the laboratories and storage areas elsewhere inside Unit 731. Warm indoor air smelled faintly of paper, tobacco smoke, lamp oil, and damp winter coats drying near the entrances. Pages rustled softly while pens scratched across forms requiring signatures and official approval. Telephones rang in brief, uneven bursts before voices lowered into formal conversation behind partially closed doors. Teacups rested beside paperwork, releasing small clouds of steam into rooms filled with the quiet movement of clerks organizing reports and schedules. Outside the office windows, the distant sound of truck engines drifted across the compound as morning activity gradually increased. It was, in every visible way, an ordinary workplace. The horror lay precisely in that ordinariness. As the workday unfolded, information moved constantly between departments through messengers, drivers, and officers assigned to specific duties within the facility. Clerks delivered transport orders toward supply divisions, while medical staff submitted reports requiring military authorization from supervising officials. Schedules shifted according to weather conditions, arriving shipments, and internal inspections carried out across the compound during different hours of the day. Secretaries copied records late into the evening beneath dim electric lights. Through countless small exchanges of documents, signatures, and instructions, the administrative system quietly coordinated the daily operation of the entire facility, ensuring that every moving part stayed in motion, that every record stayed current, that every dark activity remained invisible beneath the calm surface of institutional procedure. Looking back on these office routines creates a particular kind of discomfort because the environment resembled countless ordinary bureaucratic workplaces found throughout the modern world. Desks, schedules, forms, and official meetings appeared outwardly familiar and practical rather than openly violent. Yet within those administrative habits, enormous suffering became organized through paperwork processed calmly across polished wooden desks. The ordinary appearance of bureaucracy allowed many individuals to focus narrowly on assigned tasks without confronting the larger purpose those tasks supported. Inside the offices of Unit 731, routine administration became deeply connected to hidden brutality. The quiet rhythm of clerical work helped sustain a system whose full reality often remained buried beneath layers of procedure, institutional structure, and deliberate silence. Near the vehicle depots at the edge of the compound, drivers and transport workers followed routines shaped by weather, fuel supplies, and military schedules that governed movement across the facility. Trucks stood in long rows beside maintenance sheds where mechanics repaired frozen engines during the severe winters of Manchuria. Drivers checked tires, headlights, and cargo compartments before receiving written instructions from supervising officers near the dispatch office. Some vehicles transported food, coal, and medical supplies between buildings inside the compound. Others traveled outward toward rail depots and restricted roads leading across the occupied countryside surrounding Pingfan, carrying cargo that was never fully described in the records that survived. The transport areas carried a rougher atmosphere than the orderly offices deeper inside the administrative buildings. Cold air mixed with the smell of gasoline, wet leather gloves, machine oil, and smoke rising from repair furnaces burning through the early hours of the morning. Engines coughed heavily before warming fully in the freezing temperatures, filling the depot yards with low mechanical vibrations that echoed against warehouse walls. Drivers stamped snow from their boots before entering heated break rooms where kettles steamed beside tables covered with maps, route papers, and cigarette ash scattered beneath hanging lamps. For many transport workers, routine physical labor may have created emotional distance from the larger meaning of the system they served. Fuel deliveries, maintenance checks, cargo records, and scheduled routes offered practical concerns that demanded immediate attention throughout each workday. Yet each ordinary transport task quietly contributed to the hidden machinery of Unit 731 itself. Inside the kitchens and dining areas of the compound, cooks and food workers followed routines that began long before dawn reached the frozen courtyards outside. Large metal pots rested above coal-fired stoves where rice, vegetables, and thin soups simmered through the cold mornings. Steam gathered across the kitchen windows, while workers moved between preparation tables carrying trays through narrow heated rooms. Nearby dining halls contained long rows of benches beneath hanging lamps where guards, drivers, clerks, and medical staff gathered according to military schedules regulating meals throughout the day. The smell of boiling rice mixed with coal smoke, damp clothing, and hot tea poured into metal cups during brief meal breaks. Knives struck wooden cutting boards in uneven rhythms. Conversation moved quietly between tired workers seated beside steaming bowls. It was warmth, familiarity, and routine, the small human comforts that made everything else easier to endure and easier to ignore. As the facility continued operating through the late 1930s and early 1940s, food service routines became increasingly organized to support the expanding number of personnel working inside the compound. Even during severe winter storms, cooking crews maintained regular meal service because every layer of the compound depended upon those predictable routines continuing without interruption. Looking back, the ordinary nature of these dining routines creates a quiet sense of unease difficult to name precisely. Staff members gathered around warm meals, exchanged brief conversations, cleaned dishes, and followed familiar daily habits much like workers inside countless ordinary institutions around the world. Food, warmth, and social familiarity helped sustain emotional normalcy within an environment built upon secrecy and hidden violence, allowing many individuals to move through their days without confronting the deeper realities surrounding their work. Throughout the compound, guards carried out routines that shaped the movement of nearly every person passing through the gates, corridors, and restricted sections of Unit 731. Soldiers checked identification papers beneath electric lamps mounted beside steel gates reinforced against the severe northern winters. Rifles rested against walls near heated checkpoints. Some guards patrolled outdoor routes across snow-covered courtyards. Others remained stationed inside narrow corridors leading toward laboratories, storage areas, and underground passageways hidden beneath the compound. The physical experience of guard duty changed constantly depending on weather, location, and time of day. Outdoor patrols exposed soldiers to bitter winds sweeping across the open courtyards. Inside, the smell of cigarette smoke mixed with damp wool uniforms and coal heat near crowded guard stations where tea kettles simmered quietly beside communication equipment. As operations within Unit 731 expanded, the routines governing security became more detailed and systematic across every level of the compound. Shift rotations followed precise schedules. Guards received instructions regarding restricted areas, authorized personnel, transport movements, and emergency procedures connected to different sections of the compound. Additional checkpoints appeared as new laboratory wings and underground passages expanded beyond the original construction zones. For many guards stationed at Unit 731, daily responsibilities may have gradually become defined more by procedure than by reflection upon the larger meaning of their work. Checking documents, controlling gates, monitoring schedules, and following military orders created routines that narrowed attention toward immediate duties rather than moral awareness. The structure of military discipline encouraged obedience through repetition and hierarchy. Yet beneath those ordinary security tasks stood a system protecting hidden cruelty from outside observation. One gate, one locked door, one routine patrol at a time. As evening settled over the compound at Pingfan, the rhythm of work shifted rather than fully ended. Lights continued glowing behind laboratory windows, while clerks finished reports beneath hanging lamps. Drivers returned vehicles to maintenance sheds where mechanics inspected engines before the cold night deepened across the frozen grounds. Kitchen workers cleaned large cooking pots beside steaming sinks as guards prepared for overnight patrol rotations around the perimeter roads and watchtowers. Night inside Unit 731 carried its own atmosphere, shaped by quieter sounds and slower movement. Steam pipes knocked softly behind the walls while distant generators produced low mechanical vibrations beneath the sleeping quarters. Footsteps echoed across tiled hallways as late shift workers crossed between buildings through dim electric light. Somewhere outside, snow scraped lightly against fences during strong winds sweeping across the compound. Even during the late hours, the facility never felt completely asleep because activity continued quietly beneath the surface of ordinary routine in rooms that the daylight never fully reached. Over time, these repeated daily patterns shaped the internal culture of the compound itself. Workers learned their assigned schedules so completely that movements between offices, kitchens, checkpoints, and laboratories became automatic through repetition. New staff entering the facility adapted gradually to the established routines surrounding them, absorbing expectations through observation rather than discussion. The system depended not only upon military authority, but also upon the quiet, unquestioning predictability created by repeated everyday behavior carried out across every level of the compound, day after day, season after season, year after year. Looking back, the daily life of Unit 731 feels disturbing partly because so much of it appeared outwardly ordinary. Meals were prepared, reports were filed, vehicles were repaired, uniforms were cleaned, and schedules were followed with professional discipline similar to many other military institutions of the period. Yet within those familiar routines existed a hidden structure devoted to suffering on a massive scale. Ordinary habits helped conceal extraordinary cruelty by surrounding it with the appearance of administrative normalcy. The compound functioned because countless individuals focused on practical tasks that seemed small when viewed separately. Together, however, those routines sustained one of the darkest systems created during the Second World War. Hidden quietly behind the rhythm of everyday work, behind shared meals and filed reports, and the sound of boots crossing frozen courtyards in the dark. The routine was perfect. The bureaucracy was calm. But beneath the paperwork and the shared meals, the Maruta were waiting. In our next episode, the doors of the laboratories finally swing open, and we come face to face with the experiments that the world was never supposed to see. The true horror of Unit 731 is about to begin, releasing in just 48 hours. Do not look away.